this is a question I struggle with every day. What can we do? Because every day, more and more vessels, shadow vessels, travel through Western waters and other innocent countries' waters and risk causing accidents there. And of course, by transporting oil, keep funding the war in Ukraine. So there are no easy answers. Every answer that would have been easy has already been tried, and there is really very little we can do. I think one thing, even though it may be small, but one thing that could be done is many of these vessels, a large percentage of these vessels, travel from Russian Baltic Sea ports out to onto their global journey, which means they travel through Danish waters, so either the Great Belt or the strait between Sweden and Denmark. And Denmark and Sweden doesn't have the right to ban them because they under international maritime rules, they have the right of innocent passage. They have the right to sail through that. But what Denmark and potentially Sweden could do is to inspect many more of them to see, are the vessels seaworthy? Do they have the insurance? And the problem with that is that it would consume so much time on the Coast Guard side, and then just conducting the inspections and then investigating. So the Swedish Coast Guard and the Danish Navy, which has Coast Guard functions, they would do little else than inspecting these vessels, and they have other jobs to do. But I think that is one and potentially the most viable option. And then I think in particular, when it comes to India, which is a country that is trying to do more with the West and is not completely supportive of Russia, I think the case to be made there is that India itself, by buying this oil, risks having oil spills in its waters and indeed in its ports, and that is not would clearly not be beneficial to India.
I was going to ask you about India because of those three countries you mentioned who are the big buyers of the oil from the Russian shadow fleet: China, Turkey, India. You're right. It does feel like India is the nation with the closest ties to the West, who could be put under a bit of diplomatic pressure, could be persuaded, coerced, however you want to put it, into breaking off those ties. Do you see any sign of that happening? Obviously, we've just had an election in India. Narendra Modi's back, but not with as big a majority as he thought he might. So his position maybe isn't as strong as he thought it would be at this stage. Do you see any sign of that of India changing position?
Not yet, and I think India wouldn't change position as a result of Western pressure. In fact, Western pressure would cause India to dig in its heels and say, who are you to tell us what to do? But I think by highlighting the risk of environmental damage in Indian waters, that it is a case that global institutions, that, for example, the International Maritime Organization, international environmental groups, could make, so that as a way of highlighting that it's in India's interest to try to limit this trade, and then one could also, I think, work more closely with India to help them find other sources of oil, because clearly they want this oil, otherwise they wouldn't be importing it. And I think on top of that, one more avenue that can be pursued is for environmental organizations, Greenpeace and the like, to step in and monitor and draw attention to this trade more, not just as it relates to India, but as it relates to the entire shadow fleet and wherever it goes. Because when Western governments talk about the shadow fleet, then it sounds like it's just a Western concern. No, it's a global concern. It's a concern for everybody who cares about the health of our oceans, including the animals living in our oceans. So we've seen already in the Baltic Sea, Greenpeace has started paying attention to the shadow fleet, and I think around the world this is a course that environmental organizations should pick up, because this is such a disaster. In fact, multiple disasters waiting to happen.
Is it also, do we have to evolve how we approach the issue of sanctions and see it less as how can we hurt Russia and more how can we help Ukraine, particularly speaking in the context of the war? I mean, it's interesting now that, there's a fresh wave of sanctions where the West is going to seize frozen Russian assets and use them to fund support for Ukraine, both in humanitarian and in military terms. Is that the direction of travel here, do you think?
Yes, it looks like that will continue it's an avenue that will continue to be explored, and where we've seen actually a lot of developments recently, where Western governments have gone from saying um, there's no way we can use frozen Russian assets essentially we can't seize them. That would be illegal. But now they have found a sort of a compromise where they can use interest generated from those frozen Russian assets to help fund Ukraine, and that is, I think, a very constructive solution. Um, but one area where I think we could do more is visas for Russian officials. Now, Russian officials are essentially all they are all sanctioned now, but they all of them have families, and many of those families have. In many of those families, there are people living in our Western countries, and these family members often own property in our Western countries as well, and especially in the UK. And traditionally, Western governments have said, well, we don't punish the children for the sins of their fathers. But I think if you are a grown child of a Russian official living in the UK, and you're seeing what's happening in Ukraine, then you should either speak out, or otherwise you should be on the list of people who can be sanctioned, meaning lose their visas to the UK and the right to own property in the UK that goes with it. There is, and I think it's an area that can be explored. Not we shouldn't cancel every visa, but selectively and without sort of saying who is likely to lose their visas. We can just say every family member of an official in the Russian government risks losing their visa for as long as this war continues. And that would really hurt those in charge in Russia. They may not care about the people of Russia, but they do care about their families, just as we all care about our families.
I mean, that is fascinating. Do you think that's the most effective way of destabilizing the Putin regime as well? Because you know, if you target those in positions of influence around the Kremlin, if their lives are made uncomfortable and they look at the root cause, which is the man at the top pursuing this illegal war that's triggered all of this, does that then destabilize his position?
I believe it would. So, in every authoritarian regime, officials go along with the ruler because that's the path of least resistance, right? If you oppose him, or if you contradict him, then you face losing your job, so you go along. That is the story of autocracies. But if there were a price to pay for going along, meaning, for example, your child, your children, your wife could lose their visas to the UK, to France, the US, whatever it may be, then you would think twice, because there would be a personal price for you to pay, and Russian officials may have very few feelings of sort of, common human feelings in general, but they do love their families, and if their families were to be directly disadvantaged by this war in Ukraine, then I think they would think twice. And we should remember, they themselves are already sanctioned, and they knew they would be sanctioned, and they are happy to take that into account. But if they see their children, who are living such enjoyable lives in the UK, face the risk of having to leave the UK, then I think they would think twice.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more on global security and the war in Ukraine, you can listen to Times Radio, take out a digital subscription to The Times, and click subscribe on our YouTube channel.